The smell of rain mixed with fear was something Alara had grown accustomed to over the years, but tonight it felt different, sharper, like the sky itself knew what was coming. She pressed her body deeper into the shadows of the abandoned grain cellar, her breathing so shallow it barely moved her chest, every muscle locked in the familiar position of someone who had learned that survival meant becoming invisible. The wooden beams above her head creaked with age and rot, and through the gaps in the warped planking she could see torchlight flickering across the muddy village square, could hear the heavy synchronized footsteps of soldiers moving through the settlement in formation. Royal soldiers, the king's own guard, marked by the crimson and black uniforms that had become synonymous with absolute authority across the northern territories. Ilara had heard the rumors for weeks that Alpha King Kale Stormfang himself was conducting inspections along the border villages, ensuring loyalty, rooting out dissent, reminding everyone exactly who held power in these lands. She had planned to be long gone before his forces arrived, had packed the few belongings she owned into a worn canvas bag, and prepared to disappear into the forest as she had done so many times before. But the soldiers had come early, sweeping through the village at dusk instead of dawn. And now she was trapped, her fingers dug into the dirt floor beneath her, nails breaking against stone and root. Her whole body, trembling with a terror that went bone deep. It was not just the soldiers she feared, though they were dangerous enough with their casual cruelty and their belief that anyone weaker than them existed solely for their entertainment. It was what they represented, what they could do with impunity under laws that treated Omegas like her as property, as resources to be claimed and used by any Alpha strong enough to take them. Ilara had the scars to prove what happened when soldiers found an Omega, alone and unprotected. The marks on her ribs where boots had broken bone, the burn on her shoulder from a torch held too close, the deeper invisible wounds that made her flinch at unexpected sounds and wake screaming from nightmares where hands grabbed her in the dark. She had escaped that camp 3 years ago, had run through winter storms and across frozen rivers to get away, and she had sworn she would die before she let anyone put their hands on her like that again. But fear and determination were different things, and right now, fear was winning, flooding her system with adrenaline that made her heart hammer so loud she was certain they would hear it, that the very walls would betray her presence. The cellar door rattled suddenly, violently, and Ilara bit down on her own hand to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke skin. Heavy footsteps descended the wooden stairs, boots that sounded like thunder in the confined space, and a voice called out in the rough accent of the mountain packs, telling someone above that he was checking the storage areas. Torchlight swung across the cellar, illuminating crates and barrels, old tools hanging from rusted hooks, and Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, as if not seeing them meant they could not see her. She had wedged herself behind a collapsed section of shelving, had pulled rotted canvas over her body, had done everything she knew to hide her scent, but she was so afraid that she was certain her terror was broadcasting itself like a beacon. The soldier moved closer, his boots crunching on debris, and she could smell him now, the aggressive alpha pheromones that made her wolf whimper and try to retreat even further into the prison of her own mind. Her wolf had never fully manifested, had never been strong enough to give her the speed or strength to truly defend herself, existing only as a whisper of instinct that told her when danger was near and urged her to submit, to make herself smaller, to survive by any means necessary. Then everything changed. The soldier stopped moving, his breathing shifting to something alert and focused, and Ilara knew with sick certainty that he had caught her scent, that all her precautions had been useless. She heard him turn, heard the smile in his voice as he called up to his companions that he had found something interesting, that they might want to come down and see what he had discovered hiding in the dark. Panic exploded through her system, and she did the only thing her body would allow, scrambling out from behind the shelving and trying to run for the stairs, knowing it was futile but unable to just lie there and wait. The soldier laughed, a sound without humor or warmth, and reached for her with hands that had grabbed too many others, that knew exactly how to hurt while leaving the right kind of marks. His fingers closed around her wrist, and Ilara screamed, the sound ripping from her throat with all the terror and rage of every violation she had endured. Every moment she had been made to feel powerless and small. She twisted in his grip, fought with the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. And for one brief second she thought she might actually break free. Then his other hand grabbed her hair, yanking her head back with brutal efficiency, and his voice was hot against her ear, telling her to stop struggling, that she was only making it harder on herself, that if she was a good girl, maybe he would. Be gentle. The cellar door above them slammed open with such force that it tore off one of its hinges, the sound like thunder splitting the sky, and a presence descended the stairs that made every hair on Alara's body stand on end. The soldier's grip on her loosened immediately, his entire body going rigid with a kind of fear that transcended anything Alara had ever inspired, and she fell to her knees on the dirt floor as he released her and stepped back. The torchlight seemed to bend around the white figure that emerged from the shadows, and Alara found herself looking up at a man who radiated power in a way that made the soldier beside her feel like a child playing at authority. Alpha King Kale Stormfang stood well over 6.5 feet tall, his body built like something carved from mountain stone, all brutal angles and compressed violence barely contained beneath midnight black armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hair was dark as a starless night, pulled back, from a face that was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, all sharp planes and fierce eyes that glowed molten gold in the torchlight. But it was not his physical presence that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. It was the way he looked at her, the way those golden eyes widened just slightly as they took in her huddled form. The torn clothing, the bruises, the absolute terror written across every line of her body. If you are enjoying this story so far, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to hear more tales of supernatural romance and redemption. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about Alpha Kings and the Omegas they are destined to protect. Kale's gaze moved from Alara to the soldier, with a slowness that somehow made the motion more threatening, his expression shifting from shock to something cold and deadly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the temperature in the cellar seem to drop 10 degrees. He asked the soldier what exactly he thought he was doing, what orders he believed he was following, and whether he understood that touching an Omega without consent was a violation of the laws that Kale himself had just signed into effect 3 months prior. The soldier stammered something about just securing the area, about finding a potential threat, but his excuses died in his throat as Kale took a single step closer, the movement causing the soldier to flinch back against the cellar wall. Kale continued speaking in that terribly calm voice, explaining that he had traveled to these border villages specifically to ensure his new laws were being enforced, to root out the kind of behavior that had made the Northern Territories infamous for cruelty. And here he found one of his own soldiers demonstrating exactly the kind of violence he had come to end. The soldier tried to defend himself, tried to claim that he had not known she was an Omega, that he was just doing his job. But Kale silenced him with a look that promised consequences worse than death. Then the Alpha King did something that shattered every expectation Alara had built from years of suffering. He turned his back on the soldier, dismissing him as beneath concern, and lowered himself to one knee in the dirt beside her, making himself smaller, less threatening, his eyes never leaving hers as he asked in a voice completely different from the one he had used with his soldier, whether she was hurt, whether she needed medical attention, whether there was anyone he could call to come and be with her. Alara could not speak, could not process what was happening, her mind still caught in the loop of expected violence that had not come. She watched as Kale reached up and unclasped the heavy fur-lined cloak from his shoulders, the garment marked with the silver wolf emblem of the royal house, worth more than everything in this village combined, and he held it out to her with hands that she noticed for the first time were shaking slightly. He told her that she was safe now, that no one would touch her, that he gave her his word as king and as an alpha, that she was under his personal protection. When she still could not move, paralyzed by shock and fear and confusion, he laid the cloak gently over her shoulders, careful not to let his fingers brush her skin, and then he stood and turned back to the soldier who had gone pale as death. What happened next would become legend in the Northern Territories, a story told in taverns and around campfires. the night the Alpha King stripped rank from one of his own guards and had him dragged from the village in chains for daring to threaten an Omega under the new laws. Kale called down the rest of his unit, his voice carrying through the cellar door with an authority that had men scrambling to obey. And when they assembled, he made them all witness, as he formally charged the soldier with assault, with violation of royal decree, with bringing dishonor to the crown. He explained in clear terms that this was the new reality of the Northern Territories, that Omegas were not property, not toys for aggressive alphas to claim, but citizens of the realm deserving of the same protections as anyone else. Some of the soldiers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and exchanging glances, and Kyle addressed that discomfort directly, asking if anyone else had a problem with his laws, if anyone else wanted to challenge his authority. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the disgraced soldier being hauled away, and then Kyle dismissed his men with orders to secure the village perimeter and ensure no one else was being threatened or harmed. When they were alone again, Kyle returned his attention to Alara, who had not moved from her position on the floor, still wrapped in his cloak, still waiting for the other boot to drop. He asked her name, and she found her voice. Somehow, whispered it like a secret she was afraid to share. And he repeated it carefully as though committing it to memory. He told her his name in return, though of course she already knew who he was. Everyone in the realm knew the Alpha King, the warrior who had unified the fractured territories through conquest and force, who was said to have killed his first enemy in battle at age 12, whose very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of war. But the man kneeling in the dirt before her did not match the legends, did not fit the stories of brutal efficiency and merciless judgment. This man had eyes that held something that looked almost like guilt, like pain, as he took in her condition and seemed to be calculating all the ways his kingdom had failed her. He asked her who had hurt her before, asked if it had been soldiers under his banner, and when she nodded slowly, his jaw tightened, and something flickered across his face that might have been rage directed entirely at himself. Alara finally found the courage to ask him why he cared, why he was doing this, what he wanted from her in return. The question seemed to surprise him, and he sat back on his heels, considering his answer with a seriousness that suggested he understood the weight of what she was really asking. He told her that he had spent his whole life becoming the strongest, the most feared, believing that power meant the ability to dominate and control, and that he had built his kingdom on those principles without ever questioning whether strength could mean something different. He had signed the new laws protecting Omegas because his advisors told him it would improve his image with the international pacts, would make him seem modern and progressive, but he had not truly understood what those laws meant until tonight, until he saw her cowering in that cellar and realized that his kingdom had created the conditions that put her there. He admitted that he did not have a good answer for why he cared, only that seeing her terror had broken something open inside him, that he had kept locked away for decades. Some part of him that remembered what it felt like to be powerless and afraid, and he could not walk away from that. He offered her a choice then, something Alara had not been given in longer than she could remember. He said she could stay in the village if she wished, that he would station guards to ensure her safety, that he would provide resources to help her rebuild whatever life she wanted here. Or, if she preferred, she could come with him to the capital, to the royal castle where he could guarantee her protection personally, where she would have access to healers and resources, and the opportunity to testify about what had been done to her, so that he could continue reforming the laws that had failed her so completely. He made it clear that either choice was hers alone, that he was not commanding her or claiming her, that for the first time in what he suspected was her entire life, she had the power to decide her own fate. Alara looked at him for a long moment, studying the face of the most powerful alpha in the realm, seeing the sincerity in those gold eyes, and she made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. She told him she would go with him, not because she trusted him, but because she had learned that staying in one place too long only gave your enemies time to find you, and at least in the capital she might have a chance to become something more than a victim running from shadows. The journey to the capital took 3 days by horse, and Alara spent most of it in a carriage that Cale had commandeered from a local merchant, fitted with cushions and blankets to make the rough roads more bearable. Cale rode alongside the carriage on a massive black warhorse that matched his armor, close enough to respond to any threat but far enough to give her space, and Alara found herself watching him through the curtained windows, trying to reconcile this careful, considerate version of the Alpha King with the stories she had heard. At night, they camped with his reduced guard unit, men who had been carefully selected according to Cale after the incident in the village, soldiers who understood the new laws and who would enforce them without question. They treated Alara with a deference that felt alien and uncomfortable, bowing slightly when she passed, offering her food and water without being asked, never making direct eye contact unless she initiated it first. Cale explained that he had given strict orders about her treatment, that anyone who made her feel unsafe in any way would face immediate dismissal, and while part of her appreciated the protection, another part bristled at being treated like fragile glass that might shatter at any moment. On the second night, when the camp was quiet and most of the soldiers were sleeping, Kyle approached her tent and asked if he could speak with her, his voice carrying through the canvas with careful neutrality. Alara invited him in, curiosity overcoming caution, and he entered, ducking his head to fit through the opening. Somehow managing to make even that gesture look graceful, he carried a wooden box under one arm, and when he sat down across from her, maintaining a respectful distance, he opened it to reveal medical supplies, clean bandages, antiseptic ointments, and several small vials of what she recognized as pain medication. He told her that he had noticed she was favoring her left side, that he had seen her wince when the carriage hit rough patches in the road, and he wanted to offer help if she would accept it. Alara's first instinct was to refuse, to insist she was fine, but something about the way he asked, the way he made it clear the choice was entirely hers, made her reconsider. She admitted that her ribs were badly bruised, probably cracked from an encounter with bandits 2 weeks prior, and that she had been managing the pain. With herbs she foraged but had run out days ago. Kyle listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail she shared. And when she finished, he asked if he could examine her ribs, promising to only touch where necessary and to stop immediately if she felt uncomfortable. Alara agreed, surprising herself, and lifted the edge of her worn shirt to expose the mottled purple and yellow bruising that covered her left side. She watched his face as he looked at the damage, saw his jaw clench and his hands ball into fists before he deliberately relaxed them, and when he touched her, it was with a gentleness she had not known was possible from an alpha, his fingers barely grazing her skin as he felt along her ribcage assessing the damage. He diagnosed 2 cracked ribs and extensive soft tissue damage, and his voice was rough when he told her that she should have been given immediate medical care, that letting injuries like this go untreated could lead to complications, that she deserved better than having to forage for pain relief like an animal in the woods. He applied the ointment with steady hands, wrapped her ribs in clean bandages that smelled of lavender and something else medicinal, and gave her 2 vials of pain medication with instructions on dosage, and through it all, he maintained a stream of quiet conversation, telling her about the capital, about the reforms he was trying to implement, about the resistance he faced from traditionalists who believed the old ways were sacred. Alara found herself relaxing despite every instinct screaming at her to stay guarded, found herself actually talking to him, sharing pieces of her story that she had never told anyone. She told him about growing up in a small pack where omegas were hidden away during heat cycles, treated as shameful secrets that needed to be controlled. She told him about her wolf that had never fully emerged, about the healers who said she was broken, defective, not a real omega because she could not shift completely. She told him about the first time soldiers had come to her village, how they had dragged her and 2 other omegas away, how she had watched those others break under the abuse while she had somehow, impossibly, found the strength to escape. She told him about the years of running, of never staying anywhere long enough to form connections, of the bone-deep exhaustion that came from constant vigilance. And Cale listened to all of it, his gold eyes never leaving her face, his expression shifting through horror and rage, and something that might have been grief for the life she had been forced to live. When she finished, Cale was silent for a long moment before he spoke, and his voice was different, rawer, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. He told her that he had grown up as the spare heir to a minor pack, that his older brother had been groomed for leadership while he had been trained only to fight, to be a weapon that could be pointed at enemies and unleashed. He told her about the night his pack was attacked by rivals, how he had watched his family slaughtered, how he had survived only by tapping into a rage so complete that it had transformed him into something barely recognizable as a person. He had spent the next decade conquering territory after territory, building the Northern Territories through blood and violence, believing that strength was the only currency that mattered. He had made laws that favored the dominant, powerful, that treated weaker pack members as expendable, and he had told himself it was necessary for stability, for order, for the greater good. But seeing Alara in that cellar had forced him to confront the truth that his version of order had been built on the suffering of people like her, that his strength had enabled the cruelty of others, and he could not continue pretending that was acceptable. He admitted he did not know if he could fix everything he had broken, if his reforms would be enough to undo generations of systemic abuse. But he had to try, and having her agree to come to the capital felt like a sign that redemption was possible, even for someone who had caused so much harm. The vulnerability in his confession stunned Alara into silence, and she found herself seeing him not as the untouchable Alpha King, but as someone who was also carrying wounds, also trying to find a way forward from a painful past. She reached out without thinking, and touched his hand where it rested on his knee, the first time she had willingly initiated contact with an alpha in years, and the shock of it ran through both of them like electricity. Kyle's eyes widened and his breath caught, but he did not pull away, did not try to turn her gesture into something more, just turned his hand over, so their palms met and squeezed gently, an acknowledgement of the tentative connection forming between them. They stayed like that for several heartbeats, the silence no longer uncomfortable but charged with possibility, before Cale carefully withdrew his hand and told her he should let her rest, that they would reach the capital tomorrow, and she would need her strength. He left the medical supplies with her, reminded her to take the pain medication if she needed it, and then ducked out of the tent, leaving Alara alone with thoughts that spun faster than she could process. The capital of the Northern Territories was unlike anything Alara had ever seen, a sprawling city built into the side of a mountain, with architecture that seemed to grow out of the stone itself, rather than being imposed upon it. The royal castle dominated the skyline, a fortress of dark granite and soaring towers that had stood for over 1,000 years, and as their carriage rolled through the city streets, Alara watched through the windows as citizens stopped to stare at the king's procession, some bowing, others simply watching with cautious curiosity. When they reached the castle gates, Cale dismounted and came to open the carriage door himself, offering his hand to help her down, and Alara felt hundreds of eyes upon them as she accepted his assistance, stepping into the courtyard, wearing his cloak over her worn traveling clothes, clearly marked as someone under his personal protection. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the assembled courtiers and servants like wildfire, speculation about who she was and what she meant to the king, who had never shown interest in any Omega before, and Alara felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down on her from all sides. Kyle seemed oblivious to the whispers, or perhaps simply did not care, guiding Alara through the castle with a hand that hovered near her back without quite touching, pointing out landmarks and introducing her to key staff members who would be responsible for her care and comfort. He had prepared an entire suite of rooms for her in the royal wing, chambers that were larger than any building she had ever lived in, with windows that overlooked the mountain valleys and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. There was a bedroom with a bed so large it could have fit 4 people comfortably, a private bathing room with a tub carved from marble, a sitting room filled with books and comfortable chairs, and a small balcony garden where night-blooming flowers released their scent into the evening air. Kyle explained that the rooms had belonged to his mother, that they had been sealed since her death 20 years prior, and that he wanted Alara to have them because he thought his mother would have liked her, would have appreciated her strength. The gesture was so unexpected and so loaded with meaning that Ilara found herself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken in just 3 days. Staff members arrived with fresh clothing, toiletries, food, and offers of assistance, and Cale instructed them all personally about Ilara's comfort and security before finally turning back to her. He told her that she should rest, recover, that she was not expected to attend any official functions or meet with anyone until she felt ready, and that if she needed anything at all, day or night, she should ask and it would be provided. He admitted that the court would be curious about her, that there would be pressure for her to make public appearances and answer questions, but he would shield her from all of that for as long as she wanted. He gave her a small silver bell, explaining that it was enchanted to summon him specifically, that no matter where he was in the castle or what he was doing, if she rang it, he would come immediately. The trust implicit in that gift, the vulnerability of giving her direct access to him, was not lost on Ilara, and she accepted the bell with shaking hands, clutching it like a talisman against the uncertainty of her new situation. Over the following weeks, Ilara began the slow process of adjusting to life in the royal castle, and it was nothing like she had imagined. Kyle kept his promise about protecting her from the court's curiosity, turning away nobles who tried to gain access to her rooms, shutting down gossip with icy efficiency, making it clear that she was not to be treated as entertainment or a curiosity, but as an honored guest under his personal protection. She met with healers who treated her injuries with a thoroughness that bordered on reverent, who asked her permission before every examination, who seemed genuinely distressed by the evidence of past trauma they found. She was fitted for clothing that actually fit her properly, garments made from fabrics so soft they felt like water against her skin, in colors she never would have chosen for herself, but that the seamstress insisted brought out the green in her eyes. She was given access to the royal library, a vast collection of books that spanned centuries, and she spent hours there reading about pack history, about the laws governing Omega rights, about the political structure of the realm she now found herself part of. But more than any of the material comforts, what struck Ilara most was Cale's consistent presence in her life. He visited her rooms every evening, always knocking and waiting for permission to enter, never staying longer than an hour unless she invited him to remain. They talked about everything and nothing, about his struggles to implement reforms against opposition from traditionalist nobles, about her slowly awakening interest in pack politics and law, about philosophy and history and the small mundane details of daily life. Cale brought her gifts that showed he was paying attention to her interests, a first edition book of poetry when she mentioned loving verse, a set of high-quality drawing pencils when she admitted she used to sketch, a rare flowering plant for her balcony garden when she said she missed working with growing things. He never pushed for more than she was willing. To give never made her feel obligated to repay his kindness, and slowly, incrementally, Ilara felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. The first major challenge came 6 weeks after her arrival, when a contingent of high-ranking nobles demanded an audience with Cale to discuss what they called his questionable decisions regarding Omega protection laws. Ilara was not supposed to be present for the meeting, but she had learned the castle well enough by then to find the hidden passages that servants used, and she positioned herself where she could hear the confrontation unfold. The nobles argued that the new laws were making the northern territories look weak, that other packs would see their protection of Omegas as a sign that they had gone soft, that the traditional hierarchy existed for good reason and should not be disrupted. They pointed out that Omegas were naturally submissive, that they needed alpha guidance and control, that protecting them from necessary discipline would lead to chaos. They demanded that Kyle reconsider the reforms, that he at least create exceptions for alphas of noble blood, that he acknowledge the natural order of things. Ilara listened to their arguments with a fury building in her chest, heard the casual dismissal of her humanity, the reduction of her entire existence to a problem that needed managing, and she wanted to burst into the room and scream at them, make them see her as a person rather than a category. But before she could move, Cale's voice cut through the debate, quiet and cold and absolutely lethal. He told the nobles that he had heard their concerns and found them not only unconvincing, but personally offensive. that their arguments were based on outdated prejudices rather than any actual evidence, and that he would not be swayed by appeals to tradition that were really just excuses to maintain systems of abuse. He explained in detail what he had witnessed in the border villages, the conditions Omegas were forced to endure, the violence enacted upon them in the name of Alpha authority, and he made it clear that anyone who could not accept the new reality was welcome to leave his territory and find somewhere else to practice their cruelty. The nobles sputtered protests, tried to frame their position as concern for stability, but Kale shut them down with a finality that left no room for argument, dismissing them with a warning that if he heard of any violations of the new laws, the perpetrators would face consequences regardless of their social status. When the nobles had left, Alara heard Kale's heavy sigh, heard him move around the council room with restless energy, and she made a decision. She emerged from the hidden passage and entered the room openly, watching as Kale's head snapped up in surprise, his eyes widening as he took in her presence. She told him she had heard everything, that she had been listening from the servant corridors, and she expected him to be angry about the eavesdropping. But instead he looked almost relieved, like her presence was exactly what he needed. He asked her if he had said the right things, if his defense of the new laws had been adequate, and the vulnerability in the question, the genuine desire for her approval, made something shift in Alara's chest. She crossed the room to stand in front of him, and for the first time since they met, she deliberately entered his personal space, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to see the gold flecks in his eyes, to scent the cedar and smoke that clung to him. She told him that he had done more than say the right things, that he had proven something she had not been sure she could believe, that his commitment to change was real and not just political theater. She admitted that she had been waiting for him to reveal some hidden agenda, some expectation that she would owe him for his protection. But instead, he had consistently shown her that he meant what he said, that he truly believed she deserved dignity and respect. She reached up and placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm, and she told him that for the first time in her life, she felt safe with an alpha, that she was beginning to trust him in ways that terrified her, because trust meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had only ever brought her pain. Kyle covered her hand with his own, his fingers engulfing hers, and he told her that her trust was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him, that he would guard it more carefully than he guarded his crown, and that he was beginning to realize that what he felt for her went far beyond protective instinct or political alliance. If you have been moved by Kyle and Alara's journey so far, please take a moment to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories about love that transforms not just individuals, but entire worlds, because the bond between these two is about to become something that will reshape the Northern Territories forever. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and want, and Alara saw her own desire reflected in Kale's eyes, the careful control he maintained fraying at the edges. But he did not move to close the distance, did not try to kiss her or claim her, instead giving her the space to decide what happened next, and that restraint, that absolute refusal to take what she was not freely offering, was what finally broke through the last of her resistance. She rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his, a brief tentative touch that sent electricity racing through her entire body, and Kale made a sound low in his throat that was part growl and part plea before he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, deepening the kiss with a passion that had been building between them for weeks. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and Kale asked her if she was sure, if this was truly what she wanted, and Alara answered by kissing him again, by letting herself sink into the feeling of being wanted rather than taken, cherished rather than used. What followed was a courtship that scandalized the entire court. The Alpha King openly devoted to an Omega with no pack affiliation, no political connections, no apparent value, except that he loved her. Kale made no attempt to hide his feelings, escorting Alara to official functions, seating her at his right hand during state dinners, consulting her opinion on matters of law and policy. He commissioned artists to paint her portrait, had jewelry made in her favorite styles, filled her rooms with everything she mentioned enjoying even in passing. But more importantly, he listened to her, treated her insights as valuable, began implementing policy changes based on her lived experience as an Omega who had survived in the margins of society. Together, they established safe houses in every major city where Omegas could seek refuge from abuse, created legal aid funds to help victims bring charges against their attackers, and began a comprehensive education program to challenge the cultural attitudes that enabled violence against vulnerable pack members. The opposition to their relationship and reforms came from multiple directions: whispered campaigns in the court about Ilara's lack of pedigree, anonymous letters sent to Kale warning him that he was being manipulated, even a few bold nobles who confronted him directly about the impropriety of elevating an Omega to such a position of influence. Kale met every challenge with the same unwavering response: that Ilara had earned her place through her intelligence and courage, that he valued her perspective specifically because she had experienced the failures of their system firsthand, and that anyone uncomfortable with her presence was welcome to leave. He promoted several lower-ranking officials who supported the reforms into positions of power, gradually shifting the balance of the court toward progressive voices. And while progress was slow and met with constant resistance, the changes were undeniable. For Ilara, the transformation was internal as much as external, living without constant fear, sleeping through entire nights without nightmares, eating meals without worrying where the next would come from. These basic securities allowed parts of her that had been dormant for years to finally emerge. She discovered she had a talent for strategy and negotiation, could read people's motivations with uncanny accuracy, could craft arguments that swayed even the most stubborn opponents. She began attending council meetings officially, offering input on everything from trade agreements to military deployments, and to everyone's surprise, including her own, her suggestions consistently proved valuable. The courtiers who had dismissed her as a passing fascination of the king's gradually began treating her with genuine respect, seeking her counsel on matters related to Omega welfare and social reform. But the most significant change came 4 months after her arrival, on a night when the full moon hung heavy and silver in the sky, and Ilara felt something stirring deep in her chest that she had not felt since childhood. She had been walking in the castle gardens, unable to sleep, when the sensation hit her like a wave, her skin prickling with energy, her senses suddenly sharp enough to hear heartbeats in the castle above and smell the distinct scent of every flower in the garden, to feel the pull of the moon like a physical force. She gasped and stumbled, catching herself against a stone bench, and that was when she felt it. Her wolf rising not with the timid uncertainty it had shown before, but with absolute confidence and power. The shift came over her in a rush, bones restructuring, muscles reforming, and when it was complete, Ilara stood on 4 legs for the first time in her life, no longer the broken incomplete Omega, but a fully manifested wolf. But this was no ordinary wolf form. Her fur was pure silver, shimmering with an almost metallic sheen that caught the moonlight and seemed to glow from within. And she was larger than any Omega wolf should be, nearly the size of an alpha, built for endurance and grace rather than raw power. Most striking were her eyes, which remained their human green, but now held a luminescence that marked her as something other, something rare. She threw back her head and howled, the sound echoing across the mountains, a declaration of existence that could not be ignored. And within seconds she heard an answering howl, deeper and more resonant, as Kale responded to her call. He found her minutes later, having shifted and run from the castle at a speed that should have been impossible, his own wolf form massive and black as midnight, and when he saw her, saw what she had become, he stopped dead and stared with an expression of pure awe. They circled each other in the ancient dance of wolves, not aggressive but curious, relearning each other in this new form. And Ilara felt something click into place deep in her soul, a recognition that went beyond conscious thought. The mate bond, which had been building between them for months, suddenly snapped into full existence, a connection that tied their souls together in a way that transcended physical or emotional attraction. She could feel Kale's emotions as if they were her own, his wonder and love and fierce protectiveness, and she knew he could feel hers in return, the trust and affection and cautious hope that she was building toward happiness. They ran together through the mountain forests, racing and playing like cubs, and when they finally shifted back to human form in a moonlit clearing, they held each other and acknowledged what they both knew, that they were true mates, destined by forces older than civilization to be together. But with the full manifestation of her wolf came knowledge that had been locked away, memories encoded in her bloodline that suddenly became accessible. Alara learned that she was not simply an Omega with a delayed shift, but a descendant of the Silver Moon Healers, an ancient order of Omega wolves whose abilities went far beyond the normal Omega gifts of comfort and nurturing. The Silver Moon Healers had possessed the power to cure diseases, mend injuries that should have been fatal, and even influence emotional and psychological trauma, using moonlight and their own life force as conduits for healing energy. They had been revered in ancient times, treated as sacred, but as societies became more hierarchical and alpha-dominated, their power became a threat to those who ruled through violence and fear. The healers had been systematically hunted down and eliminated, their bloodlines scattered and driven into hiding, until most people believed they had gone extinct centuries ago. Alara's wolf had been suppressed not because she was broken, but because her ancestors had learned that manifesting their true nature made them targets, and the trauma passed down through generations had created a biological safety mechanism that kept the wolf dormant until conditions were safe enough to emerge. Now that she had manifested fully, Alara had access to abilities that made her extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily vulnerable, and both she and Kale knew that the knowledge of what she was could not be kept secret forever. The decision about how to handle the revelation became the focus of intense discussion between them, with Kale arguing for maximum security and limited disclosure, while Alara insisted that hiding would only delay the inevitable, and that they should use her abilities openly to demonstrate the value of Omega gifts, rather than continue the pattern of fear and concealment that had nearly destroyed her bloodline. They reached a compromise, announcing Alara's true nature to the Inner Council first, demonstrating her healing abilities by treating several patients who had been declared beyond medical help, and documenting the results with enough rigor to be undeniable. The reactions ranged from wonder to fear to calculated interest, and Kale made it absolutely clear that anyone who attempted to exploit or harm Alara would face his personal wrath, that she was under his protection, not just as his mate, but as a citizen of the realm deserving of safety and autonomy. He proposed making her the official royal healer, a position that would give her authority and resources while allowing her to help people. And after some debate, the council approved the appointment, making Alara the first Omega to hold a titled position in the Northern Territories government. The announcement to the broader public came during the winter solstice celebration, the largest gathering of the year, with representatives from all the major packs in attendance. Kale stood before the assembled crowd and introduced Alara not as his lover or his mate, but as the royal healer, explaining her gifts and her heritage with a pride that was impossible to miss. And then he did something that shocked everyone present. He publicly announced their mate bond, declared his intention to marry her and make her his Queen Luna, and asked the assembled pack leaders to acknowledge her as the future leader of the Northern Territories alongside him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of winter wind howling through the castle courtyard, and then slowly, tentatively, the applause began, building from a few supporters into a roar of approval that shook the stones themselves. Not everyone was pleased, of course. There were protests from traditionalists, formal objections lodged by noble families who felt an Omega Queen was an insult to their status, even a few threats made against Alara's life that were quickly traced and dealt with. But the tide had shifted, and public opinion, especially among the common pack, members who had suffered under the old system, was overwhelmingly in favor of the match. Stories spread about the king, who had found his mate hiding in a cellar and had sworn to protect her, about the healer queen, who had survived horrors that would have broken others and emerged stronger, about the couple who was transforming the Northern Territories from a realm built on dominance into one founded on compassion and strength in equal measure. The wedding took place on the first day of spring, with ceremonies that blended ancient traditions with new rituals that Alara and Kale created together, acknowledgments of partnership rather than possession, vows that spoke of mutual support rather than alpha authority. Alara wore a gown the color of moonlight, embroidered with silver wolves and healing herbs, and Kale wore traditional armor, but had it inscribed with promises he had made to her, visible declarations of his commitment to protecting not just her, but all the vulnerable members of their realm. When they spoke their vows before the assembled packs, their voices carried across the mountains, and the mate bond between them glowed so brightly that even those without supernatural sight could see it, a silver thread connecting their souls that nothing could sever. As Queen Luna, Alara threw herself into the work of reform with a dedication that inspired those around her. She established healing centers in every territory, trained other Omegas with medical aptitude to become healers, created protocols for treating trauma survivors that acknowledged the psychological wounds alongside the physical ones. She worked with Kale to rewrite laws that had been on the books for centuries, eliminating provisions that treated Omegas as property, establishing harsh penalties for violence based on pack status, creating pathways for victims to seek justice without fear of retaliation. She gave speeches at councils and gatherings, sharing her own story not for sympathy but as evidence that the system needed changing, and her willingness to be vulnerable in service of a greater cause won her support from unexpected quarters. But perhaps her most important work was quieter, more personal. She made time to meet with survivors of abuse, sitting with them in their pain, using her healing abilities to help them process trauma, offering them the same patient support that Kale had offered her. She told them that healing was not linear, that there would be setbacks and hard days, but that they deserved to be more than what had been done to them, that their worth was inherent and not dependent on how others had treated them. She watched them grow stronger, saw them reclaim pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever, and she knew that this, more than any law or policy, was how real change happened, one person at a time, one moment of compassion building on another until the culture itself shifted. Kale, for his part, continued his own transformation, learning to lead with wisdom rather than just force, to listen before commanding, to see strength in vulnerability rather than only in domination. He acknowledged publicly the harm his earlier policies had caused, offered reparations to families who had been damaged by the old system, and made himself accountable to the councils and advisors who challenged him to be better. He remained a formidable warrior when necessary, his reputation for ruthlessness in battle actually growing as he defended the new order against external threats. But he was no longer defined solely by his capacity for violence. He became known as the king who loved an Omega, enough to change the world for her. But more accurately, he was the king who learned from an Omega that the world needed changing and had the courage to do it. Their first year of marriage was not easy, filled with challenges both political and personal, moments when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm them both. There were assassination attempts that came too close to succeeding, betrayals by people they had trusted, setbacks in implementing reforms that made them question whether real change was possible. But through it all, they had each other, the mate bond between them providing strength when one of them faltered, perspective when problems seemed insurmountable, and love that transformed difficulty into opportunity. They learned to fight together rather than alone, to trust that their partnership could handle whatever came, and to find joy in small moments, even when larger struggles dominated their days. 18 months after their wedding, Alara discovered she was pregnant, and the news sent shockwaves through the realm for multiple reasons. Omega pregnancies were rare enough, but for a silver moon healer to carry a child fathered by the Alpha King suggested that their offspring would possess unprecedented power, possibly combining healing abilities with alpha strength in ways that had never been seen. The pregnancy was closely monitored by a team of healers who treated Alara with a reverence that made her uncomfortable, and Kyle became almost comically overprotective, trying to wrap her in metaphorical cotton wool until she firmly reminded him that she was pregnant, not fragile, and needed him to trust her judgment about her own body. The 9 months passed with surprising ease, Alara's healing abilities apparently extending to her own pregnancy. And when their daughter was born during a thunderstorm that shook the castle, she came into the world with a cry that sounded like a wolf's howl, and eyes that glowed silver from the moment they opened. They named her Luna, after the grandmother she would never meet. And from the moment she drew her first breath, it was clear she was extraordinary. She grew faster than normal children, her wolf manifesting when she was barely 6 months old, shifting between forms with an ease that took others years to master. She inherited her mother's silver coloring and her father's size and strength, but more than that, she carried both the healing abilities of the Silver Moon bloodline and the commanding presence of an alpha, a combination that suggested she would one day be more powerful than either of her parents. Alara and Kale raised her with care, teaching her that power was responsibility rather than privilege, that her gifts existed to serve others rather than elevate herself, and that true strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. In the epilogue of their story, 5 years after Luna's birth, the Northern Territories had been transformed beyond recognition. The reforms that had seemed radical when first proposed were now established practice, with Omega rights protected by laws that were actually enforced, healing centers operating in every major settlement, and a cultural shift that treated pack status as descriptive rather than prescriptive of worth. Other territories began adopting similar reforms, inspired by the example of the Northern Territories, and by the undeniable evidence that treating all pack members with dignity improved outcomes for everyone. Alara and Kale received visitors from across the supernatural world, alphas seeking advice on how to implement change in their own packs, omegas hoping to train as healers, scholars documenting the resurgence of the Silver Moon bloodline. On a spring evening when the air smelled of cherry blossoms and new growth, Alara stood on the same balcony where Kale had first given her shelter, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Luna played in the garden below, her silver fur catching the light as she chased butterflies with the serious concentration only children possess, and Kyle wrapped his arms around Alara from behind, his chin resting on top of her head in a gesture of comfortable intimacy. They stood together in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them from that terrified meeting in a cellar to this moment of peace and purpose. And Alara thought about all the people who had survived because of the changes they had fought for, all the futures that were now possible because someone had decided that compassion mattered as much as strength. Kale asked her if she was happy, and Alara turned in his arms to face him, seeing in his eyes the same man who had knelt in the dirt and offered her his cloak, who had sworn no one would hurt her again, and who had kept that promise not just through protection, but through transformation of the entire system that had enabled her suffering. She told him that happiness felt inadequate to describe what she felt, that she had found not just safety, but purpose, not just love, but partnership in building something larger than themselves, and that she was grateful every day for the moment he had chosen to see her as a person rather than a problem. They kissed as the last light faded from the sky, two souls bound by destiny and choice in equal measure. And below them Luna howled at the rising moon, her voice carrying across the mountains in a song of joy and promise for all the tomorrows yet to come.